A while back, a news story made the rounds about a small church in Virginia where the congregation is invited to attend services in the nude. A headline that accompanied the story read, "A congregation in Virginia says they worship the way God brought us into the world, naked." In a report from their local TV station, which included scenes filmed during a Sunday service, the minister, who is unclothed, with only the pulpit hiding his private parts, enthusiastically begins the worship by saying, "Let's take a moment, walk around, say hi to everybody, give them a hug." Takes the greeting your neighbor ritual to a whole new level, doesn't it? Talk about the risks of being real. The title of this sermon. With this month's theme at church and in our Soul Matter groups being, what does it mean to live a life of vulnerability? I briefly considered a playful, suggestion that we attend today's services in the nude, but I was afraid some of us might actually do it. More scary, of course, would be that I could be nude too. I'm reminded of many years ago when I had a job delivering singing telegrams. Sometimes my innocent victims would say through their laughter, "You're not going to strip, are you?" "No worries," I would respond. "I'm paid to entertain people." The congregants of that Virginia church, known as, seriously, Whitetail Chapel, I didn't catch it like the first 5 times I watched the video. The congregants there say that they attend these naked services to find inner peace, a peace that starts with accepting themselves. Their pastor says in his church, there's not a feeling that you have to be better than one another. We're humans. We have scars. We have what we have. We're learning to love and accept that. I appreciate what he's saying, even if I might not choose to be in the pews of his Whitetail Chapel to see him say it. A new church gives new meaning to the word pews, doesn't it? All right, I'm going to get serious now. There is a method to this madness here. I mean, seriously, all kidding aside, isn't that vision of community what we would yearn for, even if most of us would prefer to remain clothed? I mean, in our relationships with our human family, wouldn't we want to begin with a common understanding that we don't have to be better than one another, that we are enough as we are? Rather than be constantly convinced of our inadequacies, wouldn't we choose to be comfortable in our own skin, to live our lives open to all that is possible, rather than hiding from what we are sure we can't bear to see? Wouldn't we want to engage with each other without shame, knowing that others have their flaws just as we do, and that despite our imperfections, we are, in fact, worthy of love and connection and grace, just as everyone else is? The way to approach this kind of wholehearted living in community with others requires a willingness to engage our vulnerabilities, not with fear or dismissal, but with courage, with compassion, seeing our vulnerabilities not as weaknesses, but actually as the birthplace of love and belonging, as our common experience of our common humanity, as, in the words of Brené Brown, the cradle of the emotions and experiences we crave. Brené Brown, you may have heard her name before. She's a research professor who spent many years studying vulnerability and shame. Her books and TED Talks have been seen by millions over the past few years. If you're not familiar with her work, I encourage you to check her out. She contends that we too often see our vulnerability as weakness, especially if we've wrongly confused our feelings with failing, our emotions with liabilities. She encourages us to see vulnerability as life's great dare and not shy away from the opportunities for transformation and possibility vulnerability can offer. The vulnerability she points to is not about weakness or submission or martyrdom or offering an invitation to others to abuse us. It's a vulnerability through which we can engage and experience life as it is, from a place of inherent worthiness, even when doing so leads us into uncomfortable territory. We all know about vulnerability. We know this, because when Brown asked people to finish the sentence, "vulnerability is," she got lots of responses that may sound familiar to you. I'm going to read some of them from her book, Daring Greatly. Again, she asked interviewees to finish the sentence, "vulnerability is." And here's some of what they said. Vulnerability is sharing an unpopular opinion, standing up for myself, asking for help. Vulnerability is saying no, starting my own business, helping my 37-year-old wife with stage 4 breast cancer make decisions about her will. Vulnerability is hearing how much my son wants to make first chair in the orchestra and encouraging him while knowing that it's probably not going to happen. Calling a friend whose child just died. The first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is signing up my mom for hospice care. Saying I love you first, not knowing if I'm going to be loved back. Getting promoted, not knowing if I'm going to succeed. Trying something new. Vulnerability is getting pregnant after 3 miscarriages. It's waiting for the biopsy to come back. It's admitting I'm afraid. It's laying off employees. Standing up for myself and for friends when someone else is critical or gossiping. Vulnerability is asking for forgiveness. Having faith. She says, do these sound like weaknesses? She says this kind of vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability shown in those examples, when engaged, sounds like truth and feels like courage. That vulnerability dares us to show up, to be seen, and then to deal with the consequences, trusting that we're going to be better for them. She begins this book, this Daring Greatly book, on the power of vulnerability with a passage from a famous speech given by Theodore Roosevelt in 1910. Many of you may have heard it. It's often referred to as the man in the arena. It's not the critic who counts, Roosevelt said. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again. Because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Hence the title of the book, Daring Greatly. Brown's research has shown that the spirit of Roosevelt's words are at the core of what being open to our vulnerability is all about. To work with our vulnerability, to get into the arena, to strive valiantly, to err, to come up short again and again is to dare greatly. It is to risk being real. As one of the people she interviewed in her research put it, vulnerability is like being naked on stage and hoping for applause rather than laughter. Or I could add from my own experience, showing our real selves and hoping for compassion rather than crickets. I should explain. Growing up, my siblings and I, always eager to tease each other as siblings are, had a ready retort when one of us would tell a joke that was not greeted with laughter. Calling upon our knowledge of sitcom and cartoon humor, and the sound effect often used to indicate a lack of response, we would say, "Hear the crickets?" Chirp, 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 chirp. You know what I'm talking about, right? One of the risks of being vulnerable is that we may hear the crickets in response. I know I have. Couple brief examples. When I was in college, I just hung up the phone after a very lengthy, long-distance conversation with my very long-time girlfriend. Our relationship had finally and decisively reached its end. I was exhausted and I was hurting, both for her and for me, and I was in need of support. I left my dorm room that winter afternoon to meet up with some classmates, people I looked to as friends, people I thought would want to, hold this sorrow with me. The timing probably wasn't the best for me to bring my downer breakup energy to the group, but as I walked with them across campus, I couldn't help myself. I shared what had happened. I shared how bereft I felt. I may not have been crying on the outside, but I definitely was on the inside. This group, it seemed, could hold none of my sorrow, or at least they were too distracted to do so that afternoon. There in the winter cold, even with my friends around me, I was painfully alone, and all I could hear was the crickets. Another story, the early days of my ministry, I was at a ministers' meeting where my colleagues and I were considering the concept of freedom. We shared a silent exercise during which we were asked by the facilitator to reflect upon the places in our lives where we experienced freedom. As my colleagues seemed to be scribbling down lists of answers in their notebooks, I just looked at an empty page. At that time, new to ministry, new to the challenges of it, the demands of the job were dominating my life. I knew it probably wasn't supposed to be like this, but I wasn't experiencing freedom much at all. I didn't even have kids yet. Soon, my colleagues, one by one, began sharing. When it was my turn, I summoned up the courage to claim what I knew to be true. I find freedom for an hour or two after I go home from Sunday services, I said. Then I'm not free anymore. I didn't know my colleagues well yet, but I was sure that my experience was common. It had to be. I figured others might chime in. Maybe we would start to have a conversation about how we could support one another, or at least alter our perspectives enough to not feel trapped by our work. But to my surprise, I received only blank stares. It was a full cricket symphony. In both of those examples, upon hearing the crickets, I translated that silence, that lack of response I had expected, into another story of my inadequacy. A story of how, I just must be an outlier. Maybe not even worthy of the compassion I expected. Maybe I just had problems. And so on. There's this victim mode I put myself into that didn't serve anyone, especially me. And I retreated further into myself in those groups. I didn't follow up with more carefully, well-timed questions or conversations afterwards. I missed opportunities I could have had for real connections with those people. Looking back these years later, I now know I had set myself up for the crickets and my companions too. I now see that my disappointment in the lack of response in both of those stories was more about my expectations than it was about the failures of those around me to meet my needs. It's about my expectations. I could have been floodlighting, I've learned. Floodlighting. It's a term that Brown uses to describe when we seek to soothe our pain by overwhelming our companions with our vulnerability, or at least catching them off guard, as if we had shined a floodlight into their faces. When we floodlight, our companions have no choice but to turn away, leaving us feeling unheard, maybe even intensifying our own feelings of shame and disconnection, offering us what we are sure is just more evidence of how unworthy we are. Living a life of vulnerability, Brown suggests, does not mean that we should be telling everyone everything every moment we feel it. On the contrary, she says vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. To be vulnerable in this way requires trust. Trust that doesn't just appear because we want it or because we need it to be there. It's trust that we build with other people slowly over time. She tells a story of her daughter, Ellen, who as a third grader had been vulnerable with a friend of hers, sharing something at school that happened to her earlier that day. By lunchtime, everybody in Ellen's class knew her secret, and she was devastated. She came home in tears, telling her mom that she was never going to tell anyone anything ever again. Brown says she identified so much with her daughter's feeling of betrayal that she had to fight the urge to agree with her. That not sharing anything with anyone ever again was a good idea. Brown knew from her research that nurturing connections with others, particularly connections of trust, has a lot to do with our ability to build up what she calls shame resilience, our ability to work our way through our shame. It's those connections that help us live wholehearted lives in which we acknowledge our imperfections, yet we know we are still worthy of love and belonging. So she sensed that this moment with her daughter was a moment that maybe they could learn something together. So she searched her brain for the right way to have the conversation, and then she remembered that the teacher of Ellen's class had a marble jar on her desk. Those of you with elementary school students may know about the marble jar. Certainly Leah's classrooms have had it. It's this idea that the teacher has a jar on her desk, and when the class makes good choices, she puts some marbles in it, and when the class is breaking rules, she takes marbles out. And when the jar is full, everybody gets to have a party. It's motivation, anyway. The marble jar. Well, Brown told her daughter to think about her friendships in life as marble jars. Each time someone is supportive or kind or honors something special that we share about ourselves, we put marbles in the jar of that friendship. And when, as it happens, people are rude or unkind or blurt out our secrets, we take some marbles out. The more marbles we have with our friends, the better we feel about them, the more that we can share. Well, hearing this, Ellen was delighted to acknowledge that despite the disaster her day at school had been, she did in fact have marble jar friends. Friends she could rely on, friends she could trust, friends she could be real with. Most of us do, Our challenges with vulnerability, it seems, come when, in my words, we expect compassion from people who have lost their marbles. Or maybe they never had them in the first place. It's not always their fault. And that brings me to another risk of being real. The risk it is to put ourselves out there for cynics and critics who will see our vulnerability as an invitation to tear us down. whenever we choose to enter the arena of vulnerability, we can expect, we know this from experience, we can expect to be attacked by those who would prefer that we not be there. Probably because they can't or won't be in the arena themselves. Now, let me be clear, not every critique we receive qualifies as an attack, even if it doesn't feel good to receive it. And cynics, too, can offer important feedback to us. Just because it can be painful to hear others' perspectives doesn't mean we shouldn't hear them. However, the risk is that when we give too much power to those who are seeking to knock us down without cause, or make us feel bad about ourselves, or question our inherent worth, or too often work out their own shame and vulnerability issues by stomping on ours, we can internalize their unnecessary negativity. We can make it our own. We can spend too much energy trying to please or convince those who have not earned our attention. Brown makes this point by quoting author Scott Straton, who says, "Don't try to win over the haters. You're not the jackass whisperer." I love that quote. Don't try to win over the haters. You're not the jackass whisperer. I put it on my Facebook page yesterday. Within minutes, the likes started pouring in. Clearly, lots of people identified with trying to win over the haters. I had to wonder, who are all these haters that we need to stop trying to win over? Who are all these haters? Are we really the victims that we think we are? Or maybe we need to stop having such high expectations of how we're going to be received by others. How others should behave. I appreciate how Brown describes the vulnerability tightrope we all walk. She says, when we stop caring about what other people think, we lose our capacity for connection. And then when we become defined by what people think, we lose our willingness to be vulnerable. If we dismiss all criticism, we lose out on important feedback. But if we subject ourselves to hatefulness, our spirits get crushed. It's a tightrope. We're all walking it, aren't we? Her suggestion is we just try to stay as balanced as we can. We try not to be afraid of vulnerability, but not fully surrendering to it either, you know. And maybe try to have just a few people in our lives, not the whole world, a few people in our lives, hopefully who have their marbles, who can occasionally give us the reality check we need with love. One more story. On Thursday, my daughter Leah asked me to take her to a music performance of her classmates at her school. I wasn't sure I wanted to spend the evening after a busy day going to an elementary school concert in which my daughter wasn't even performing. But I admired that she wanted to show up for her friends, you know, that she wanted to be a marble jar friend. Plus, I knew I'd get to spend time with her, which is always a bonus. I like my daughter. So I went. We entered just as the first act, which was the 4th and 5th grade orchestra, was finishing its set. I knew immediately that I had made the right decision to go. I just savored the gentle confidence and the kindness of the orchestra conductor as the clumsy sounds of 4th and 5th graders pulling bows across stringed instruments filled the air. For those who believe in an all-loving, ever-present God, could there be a better representation of the spirit that God must have than an elementary school orchestra conductor? Beautiful. Next came the primary attraction for Leah, the choir, where a lot of her friends were singing. As these young people stood up and began singing, some I could see were definitely, into it, delighting in the crowd reaction, savoring the joy of making music. And then others were maybe more reserved. Maybe they were afraid to let the songs flow out of them with the same gusto others showed. Maybe they were less confident of their knowledge of the music. Who knows for sure? Still, most of these 10 and 11-year-olds seemed to be reveling in their worthiness. They did not question why they were there. Of course they should be standing on the risers. Of course they should be sharing music. Of course people would enjoy their performance. Wrong notes, wrong words, missed entrances, they don't matter. Living in the moment does. Following a wrong note with a right note, laughing off the mistakes, singing, singing, singing. I loved it. My favorite part of the concert, though, was during the band portion of the show. After the small ensemble of assorted brass, woodwinds, and drums played a couple of short pieces, the director praised the young musicians for their dedication and their good behavior throughout the year. She shared the joy she has experienced working with them and suggested that we should all be proud. The worthiness of these young people was clearly on display. And now, she continued, we will close with "We Will Rock You." She turned back to her students, and silence hung in the room as we all anticipated the familiar sounds of the 1970s Queen rock anthem, an anthem of confidence, strength, and worthiness. Now I really knew why I had gone to that concert that night. Could there be a better soundtrack for a sermon on vulnerability and the risk of being real than a school band playing "We Will Rock You"? Don't we all want to believe that we can rock, even when we clearly don't? Why wouldn't we all want to live in a world where we know that we are here to make music, even as we make mistakes? Where the songs we work on and play together are received with the joy and the love in which they are offered, rather than in the fear of never-ending inadequacy, where the beauty and charm of this life we share is not in its perfection, but in its flaws, messy, awkward, and somehow artful, all the same. Watching that band of young people reveling in their imperfection, I was reminded yet again that in this life that is not ours to keep, in this life in which each of us, one way or another, will be broken, we're all in this together. We don't have to be better than one another. We're humans. We have scars. We all have what we have. We're all learning to love and accept that. Aren't we? We're all learning. We're all learning in our way to let go of who we ought to be and embrace who we are. We're all learning to accept the risks of being real. So here's to the lessons we may have yet to learn and the vulnerability we share that will make them possible.